We are at the point, and I apologize to all of you for the delay. We do have Zoom back up and running, which is good. At this point in time, we were able to take care of some legal issues. We've also dealt with some items of evidence for the defense side. So again, all of the exhibits that people talked about, you can consider them. There was only certain items, though, that I'm allowing into evidence. So just, if you don't have it, that's because I said you couldn't have it for one reason or another. But you can always consider the testimony. With that being said, the defense intend to call any other witnesses?
No, Judge, not at the time. Defense rests.
All right, so the defense rests. At this point in time, will there be any rebuttal?
Yes, Judge.
Okay, you can call your next witness.
Thank you, Judge. The state calls Dr. Park Dietz.
Okay. Dr. Parks-Dietz, can you just do me a favor? Can you put your left hand on the Bible, raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay, you can take a seat. And once you're comfortable, if you're comfortable, you can remove your mask. And if you can state your full name for the record and spell your last name, please.
I'm Dr. Park Dietz, D-I-E-T-Z.
Doctor, just to make sure that you know, we got to make sure you're loud enough so juror number 16 can hear you all the way in the back, okay? And that microphone is right in front of you. Unfortunately, it doesn't move it won't move any closer to you, but you can just keep an eye on that, okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Ms. Sidley, go ahead.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
That's fine, thanks.
Before we get started with anything, I'm going to approach you with a PowerPoint that's already up on the screen. I believe that you've already seen that PowerPoint. It would help you with your testimony here today. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay, that's been marked previously as State's Rebuttal Exhibit SR80, if I can approach the witness judge.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I'm handing you S80, SR80. Doctor, what do you do for a living?
I'm a forensic psychiatrist.
What does that mean?
It means that I specialize in that area of psychiatry involving issues that are in dispute, typically for court.
And as a part of your practice and in your experience, do you keep a resume?
Well, we call it a CV, but it's essentially a long resume.
Okay, and you keep a CV?
Yes.
All right, I have what's been previously marked as SR74, if I can approach the witness judge.
Okay.
Thank you. Doctor, I am handing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit SR74. Do you recognize that document?
I do.
What is that?
This is a copy of my CV as of July 15, 2021.
How many pages is that CV?
At that time, it was 104 pages.
At that time. Does that mean it has gotten longer since?
I think so, yes.
Okay. We'll talk about your experience, but first I'm going to ask you, in order to become a forensic psychiatrist, did you have to go to school?
Yes.
Okay. What kind of education do you have to qualify you for that position?
Well, college, medical school, and residency. And at the time that I became a forensic psychiatrist, there were a handful of fellowships around the country that allowed one to specialize in forensic psychiatry.
Okay, so you said college, right? Where did you go to college?
Cornell University in upstate New York.
And after you went to college, medical?
Correct.
And where did you go to medical school?
Well, I graduated from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in 1975.
Did you get any other degrees from Johns Hopkins University at that time or a little bit later?
At that time, I also received a master's degree in public health, which was another school across the street from the hospital, and had finished everything except dissertation for a PhD in what was called social relations, which is essentially sociology.
Did you ever go back and finish the dissertation, or did you later get a PhD?
At the last possible moment, I submitted a dissertation and received the PhD.
Okay. After that, do you have to do some additional training in order to move ahead as a forensic psychiatrist?
Yes, to become a psychiatrist at that time required 3 years of residency, And that's a period during which one is taking care of patients in a hospital, in the emergency room, outpatients as well, and being supervised for training. I did 2 years of residency at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, and then did my 3rd and final year of residency at the University of Pennsylvania as Chief Fellow in Forensic Psychiatry at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, in those 2 positions, so those 3 years, first as a resident and then as the chief resident, I think you said?
Chief Fellow.
Chief Fellow. What were you doing during that time? You mentioned you were in hospitals. What were you doing?
Well, during 2 of the years, I was treating patients. During the 3rd year, when I was doing the forensic fellowship, I was conducting forensic evaluations under supervision, was leading other fellows in their evaluations forensically, had a few private outpatients that I saw, and was heavily involved with the Center for Studies in Criminology, attending seminars at the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office every week, and working on research.
After you do those 3 training years, what is the first position that you held?
I became assistant professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School.
How old were you at that point?
29 or 30.
So 29 or 30, you're at Harvard Medical School.
Yes.
And what is your position there?
Well, my academic appointment was as assistant professor in the med school. My actual appointment was at McLean Hospital, which was Harvard's private psychiatric hospital, with an assignment to go to the state's hospital for the criminally insane and try to transform it into a Harvard teaching hospital.
And were you successful there? What was that experience? What did it entail?
Well, I would say that we succeeded in reducing the frequency with which the patients, whom they called inmates, were mistreated. We improved the quality of evaluations, but it certainly didn't transform it into an adequate institution.
Okay. What year is this?
This is 1978 to 1980.
And what are you doing while you're working there at this time?
I was responsible for all the forensic evaluations in the hospital, which had 400 or 500 beds, and I had an inpatient unit that I was responsible for treating the 30 patients. And as head of forensic psychiatry, I was responsible for seeing to it that about 1,000 pretrial evaluations get done each year. When I calculated how much time that allowed for each one, I insisted on getting some help and eventually recruited some other people to assist in doing it.
Okay, so there were about 1,000 being done per year, you said, of evaluations?
Yes.
And the pretrial context?
Yes.
So would those be things like determinations of sanity or insanity or competency for trial?
Yes, as well as recommitment hearings about the dangerousness of people who've been committed there.
Okay. And you said about 1,000. Were you the only one working there to start when you needed to recruit more people?
Well, there were other psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers, but not assigned to do forensic work initially. And they were reluctant to do it because they had heavy treatment responsibilities. So I had to recruit new people to come do that.
You just said psychologists and psychiatrists. What's the difference between the two?
Psychiatrists or medical doctors have to go to medical school. Psychologists follow a different curriculum and also have to undergo intense clinical training after they get their PhD, but they're not trained in the rest of the biomedical sciences.
And you're which type, a psychiatrist or a psychologist?
I'm a psychiatrist.
So you're a medical doctor?
Correct.
Do medical doctors like psychiatrists often work with psychologists hand in hand?
Yes.
And do you often work with psychologists as well?
Yes, I do.
After you complete that position or your time in that position, what do you do next?
What did I do after that?
Yes.
So in the midst of that work, I was asked to take responsibility for the evaluation of John W. Hinckley Jr. after he was charged for the attempted assassination of President Reagan. And so I took leave from the hospital to spend half my time for a year conducting that evaluation. I also received a subcontractor grant from the Criminology Center at Penn that allowed me to do research on the relationship between mental disorder on the one hand and criminal behavior on the other.
And did you do that research?
I did.
How long did it take you to do that research?
That's what I did for a lot of the rest of that year. So it was a year doing those two things essentially. I wrote some other things as well, began doing a lot of collaboration with the FBI's behavioral science unit during that time.
Can I ask, at that specific time, were there a lot of professionals who had the same area of study?
Well, there were certainly a lot of people who had some interest in it, but forensic psychiatry was a small subspecialty at the time. And the major organization for that subspecialty, the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, was one I had participated in heavily even during medical school. And so I saw the organization grow from 50 to 100 to a few hundred, now thousands of psychiatrists. And of course, psychologists have their organizations with even larger numbers of people involved in the field.
And is that organization an organization just to kind of keep up with each other and study trends, or what's the purpose of it?
Well, originally, I believe it would be fair to say the purpose was to improve practice by beginning to set some standards, exchanging ideas, thinking through how this could be done better, then presenting scientific research, and ensuring there was a place that could set ethical guidelines, create standards, create practice guidelines that would improve the field as a whole.
Did your position in the Harvard Teaching Hospital help inform you with regard to those areas that you wanted to improve?
It did help inform me, yes.
In what ways?
Well, for one thing, I saw firsthand how badly things could be done at this awful place, Bridgewater State Hospital. At the other extreme, I had some contact with leading scholars in Harvard Law School, Professor Alan Stone and Alan Dershowitz, who were critiquing bad things about forensic psychiatry. And I made it a goal to try to improve what I could of the field.
And I mean, even jumping ahead, and we'll get to the rest of your experience, but is that still one of your goals today?
I spend less of my time at it, but yes, I think it's important that everyone who's active in this field and has the ability to influence how it's done has some duty to try to promote improved standards of practice, improved methods that produce transparency and integrity, and that the field still needs help.
After you are finished in your position at Harvard and you finish in your position or your role in the John Hinckley Jr. trial, what do you do next?
After the Hinckley trial, I was recruited by a number of universities and accepted a position originally as an associate professor of law and associate professor of behavioral medicine and psychiatry at the University of Virginia, half-time in the law school, half-time in the medical school.
And when you were there in the medical school and the law school, what was your focus? What did you teach?
In the law school, I taught with legal colleagues, that is with other law professors, courses on law and medicine, law and public health, psychiatry and criminal law, psychiatry and civil law, and I taught solo a course on crimes of violence. That was a criminology seminar. In the medical school, the teaching was clinical, and I was medical director of the forensic psychiatry clinic, and in that role conducted evaluations and supervised the evaluations by other psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. And we trained law students, medical students, nursing students, and forensic psychiatry fellows, as well as the residents from the hospital.
You said that at that time you were the clinical director. What was the role, your official title?
Medical director of the forensic psychiatry clinic within the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy.
A little big for a business card, but did you, once you finished there, do you stay in Virginia or do you end up moving on?
Well, I stayed for a while. I was promoted to professor of law and professor of behavioral medicine and psychiatry. And then I decided I wanted to do something different. And so I moved on in about 1988.
Where'd you go?
I moved to California. I had a year earlier started a business called Threat Assessment Group and wanted to help grow that, and was already doing a lot of private forensic consultation. And so those were the two things I primarily did from that point on. Though I did get a teaching appointment at UCLA, where I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences, and have been in that part-time role for 30-some years.
You remain in that role?
Yes.
So you said Threat Assessment Group is one of your businesses?
Yes.
Okay. What is the focus of that group?
Threat Assessment Group today works for primarily large corporations to prevent violence in the workplace. And we do that in three primary ways. The first is through training. We train from the most senior executives to the senior managers in human resources, security, law, and several other departments that are actively involved. And we either train or license training that we've created for all of the managers and all of the employees. And that's the training aspect. The second thing we do is to set up teams within the corporation, often one team for the entire multinational corporation, that will receive complaints of bad behavior and then proceed to manage it by investigating what the facts are, determining what the options are, and managing the case to a successful outcome. And the third thing we do is consultation, in which we advise these clients when they have a tough case. They call for our assistance in managing the case, and we advise them, usually from afar, occasionally going on site to do a dangerous termination or interview.
Okay. So are you still actively involved in that company?
Yes, I'm the founder and the president, and I'm involved every day.
Why, can I ask, based on your experience, why did you start that company?
My very first day at Harvard, my boss wasn't aware that I was arriving that day and tried to find something for me to do before the hospital physician was ready. He flipped through his messages and said, "Go handle this." And it was a message saying that an employee at a local company had made a threat to kill his boss. I thought, well, how do you handle that? There was no handbook, no guidebook. There was nothing written about that topic. And I fumbled my way through it, and nothing went terribly wrong. But I thought to myself, someday somebody needs to figure out how to do these things. And that began my interest in it. And as I began to work with the dangerous mentally ill at Bridgewater, it became increasingly apparent that the story of people who do terrible violence never begins with the violence. There's always a story leading up to it often a story of missed opportunities to prevent the violence. That somebody didn't receive the attention they needed, nobody noticed the warning signs, or when they noticed them, they didn't do the right thing. And that seemed to me a giant gap that affected public safety and public health and filled correctional institutions with all the people who had slipped between the cracks. So I set out to find ways to try to improve that societal issue, starting with efforts to predict and prevent violence at Bridgewater, which were fruitless when I learned that the incentives were all working in the wrong direction. People were incentivized to get injured so they could be free for hunting season or for hockey season. And there was a lot of resistance to trying to improve the safety for the correctional staff or the patients. And it took a while to figure out which institutions were eager to get better and which aren't. But eventually, having spent a great deal of time dealing with schools, universities, celebrities, and businesses, I found that businesses were the best fit for what I had to offer and the most willing to take advice that kept people safe.
So it's a preventative company, is that?
Very much so.
Okay. With regard to the other company that you have, what's that called?
The other company is called Park, Dietz and Associates, and it's a forensic firm that services attorneys. Attorneys call us and ask for assistance on legal cases they're dealing with. If we have the appropriate expertise, we'll assign people to the case and give the attorneys options for who they may want to work with on the case. And that grew out of my private practice, which by about 1990 had expanded to the point that I needed help, and I began taking on some associates informally. And then finally in 1995, I incorporated. And so for the past 27 years, we've operated under that rubric.
And the type of people that work for you, are they all forensic psychiatrists or something else?
No, the largest number are forensic psychiatrists and forensic psychologists, but we also have retired FBI profilers, retired FBI interviewers and calligraphers, people from the security profession whose primary experience is running security for Fortune 500 companies, forensic social workers, nurses, a few toxicologists and pathologists.
And I don't think that you mentioned this yet, but did you say whether or not you're still active in any professional organizations as it relates to forensic psychiatry?
I didn't say, but I am somewhat involved with the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, occasionally giving a talk, and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, for which I occasionally review articles. It's been a couple of years since I've given a talk.
Have you ever received any honors or awards for forensic psychiatry?
Yes.
Like what type?
Well, the one I'm most proud of is from the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law. I received a teaching award because I had done so much teaching in that organization.
Have you ever been published in any professional publications?
Yes, I have.
Okay. About how many?
Over 100.
Over 100 publications?
Yes.
And is it in any one area that you often write about?
Well, it is primarily about forensic psychiatry, violent crime, sex crimes.
You have mentioned forensic psychiatry, and you gave us kind of the definition of forensic psychiatry. You've also said things like clinical, and your clinical experience. Can you tell us what the difference between clinical psychiatry and forensic psychiatry is?
Certainly, it's a very sharp distinction. So clinical psychiatry involves the assessment and treatment of patients for the benefit of the patient. Forensic psychiatry is the evaluation of people who are not patients. We call them evaluees most often. And that's for the benefit of their lawyers or the state or the federal government or whoever's seeking the evaluation. So the goal from the beginning is quite different. Is it for the patient or is it for some third party? And that distinction became important when Alan Stone, the Harvard scholar I mentioned earlier, who sadly recently passed away, pointed out the difficulty of dual agency, the problem that arose if one tried to serve two masters. You can't be both the patient's advocate and sponsor and helper and also be objectively analyzing for some third party. They're two very separate roles. The second distinction between the two has to do with the methods used. In clinical evaluation, it's most common to spend time with the patient, to listen to the patient, to believe what the patient has to say, because you assume they want to get better because they're there for help. And occasionally there's contact with a family member who might be at the bedside if the patient's hospitalized, or might bring them into the emergency room, and one tries to get a bit of history from them. If one's getting prior treatment records, which would happen for an inpatient admission, there usually isn't time to review them all. Instead, what clinician most often does is look at the discharge summaries for past hospitalizations and maybe the very most recent records from an outpatient therapist. And of course, there's no attention paid to crime scenes or the other things related to crime. In forensic psychiatry, the method is extremely different. Not only does one interview the individual whose behavior is at issue, one also has to ensure that there have been interviews by someone of all the relevant witnesses, of family members, and one has to look at investigative reports. If we're talking about a criminal case, I'll limit it to that. Crime scene photos, autopsy videos, crime scene videos, any electronic records that were seized and examined. Sometimes there are forensic science reports from toxicology or hair and fibers, or tool marks, firearms, and so on. Whatever has been done by law enforcement for the investigation has to be scrutinized by the expert, who, having done all that and after being informed, then will do an evaluation of the defendant, whether that's for the government or for the defense. When it's for the state or government, it's often quite delayed. When it's for the defense, it might be the day of arrest or a week later or a month later, depending on how quickly things move. And when I do evaluations forensically, since 1982, I have attempted to audio tape and videotape every one.
We're into a narrative now, pretty far off the question.
You can follow up with your next question.
Sure. So you were talking about the difference between clinical psychology, psychiatry and forensic psychiatry. And you were going through the different methodologies that you take with clinical versus forensic. In your best practice, how would you go about making sure that you are documenting everything you do as a forensic psychiatrist?
Well, of course, one has to retain all of one's notes because they could become important in some subsequent proceeding. One has to make sure that one keeps the copies of any research studies on which one relies because they have to be produced. And probably the single most important thing is how is one going to adequately capture any examinations and interviews that are done. That particular thing can be done in a variety of acceptable ways. From my point of view, the bare minimum is to have a verbatim record. And the ways to have a verbatim record are to have a court reporter or stenographer present, which I find disruptive and not always that accurate. Second, to audio tape, which preserves at least the words, but not the nonverbal behavior. And best of all is videotape. My habit is to videotape with an audio tape backup if there's any uncertainty as to the system. And if I'm using my own equipment, there's uncertainty because I forget to press buttons.
Uncertainty for you.
Yeah, exactly.
You can. Okay, that's fair. As a forensic psychiatrist and as a clinical psychiatrist, you had an opportunity to practice in both areas, right?
Yes.
What was the experience as a clinical psychiatrist? Is that the hospitals that you worked in and the direct patient contact you had?
So my clinical experience was primarily from 1975, because you start having some in medical school, up through the late 1980s when I moved to California. I haven't treated patients since moving to California.
Okay, so
But during those years, 10, 12, 15 years, I did treat patients. And I treated them in a variety of settings: inpatients, outpatients, private practice patients, and emergency room settings.
in the forensic setting, so as a forensic psychiatrist, have you been involved in cases in which the defendant has raised mental issues in a criminal case?
Oh, yes.
Okay, approximately how many cases have you done an evaluation in those circumstances?
So the question pertains to evaluations in criminal cases, regardless of who raised the issue.
Yes.
Then it would be well over 1,000. I stopped counting at 1,000 in 1980.
Okay. So 1,000 in 1980.
Up to 1980, yeah.
And you continue to practice right now, right?
Yes, but not at that rate.
Okay. About how many times have you testified in a criminal proceeding with regards to the evaluations that you've done?
More than 100, probably not more than 200.
In all of the many times that you have testified, have you ever realized that you've been mistaken about something?
Yes.
Okay, and how many times has that happened?
Twice that I'm aware of.
Okay, what happened?
So in one case, I had written a report in which I thought that the defendant's behavior might have been influenced by a news event before his crime, and learned during cross-examination that the news event was after the defendant's alleged crime. And I was simply wrong about that. Hadn't looked up when the news event occurred, and it got corrected during cross.
Okay. How recently was that?
15 years ago, maybe.
How many times do you think you've testified since that point?
Since then,
Since then?
150, 200.
And then you said there was another one.
Yes, the other one was more consequential. It was in the trial of Andrea Yates for killing her 4 children. And in that instance, during cross-examination, I was asked a question about my work for a television show. And the answer I gave was a sentence that was untrue. I mistakenly remembered a sentence. Well, I remembered the sentence accurately, but I forgot where I learned it.
Okay.
And that caused all kinds of trouble.
Okay. So in that instance, when you said that you mistakenly said something else, did you do that on purpose?
Pardon me?
Did you do that on purpose?
No, of course not.
Okay. And that was eventually corrected, is that right?
Well, after a long, arduous road, my error got corrected, yes.
Okay. And without going into what ultimately was found or the outcome of what the cases were, what types of criminal cases have you been involved in terms of forensic psychiatry?
I've probably been involved in just about every kind of criminal case there is, though it's been a long time since I've done very minor crimes. The cases that I've increasingly limited my criminal practice to are mass murder, serial murder, and assassination. If it doesn't involve those, I try to ensure someone else is handling the case so that I can focus on those.
You mean someone else from your company?
Yes.
Okay. And in terms of the types of cases you've been involved in, were you involved in the prosecution of Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yes.
What about Theodore Kaczynski?
Ed Kaczynski, yes.
The Menendez brothers?
Yes. Well, one of them.
One of them. Which one?
I don't remember now which one it was.
From a long time ago. Elizabeth Broderick?
Yes.
Were you involved in the Boston Marathon bombings or that investigation or evaluation?
I was involved for the U.S. Attorney's Office as a rebuttal expert.
What about the O.J. Simpson trial?
Well, I was approached by the defense in a criminal case and turned it down, and then was later hired by the plaintiffs suing O.J. Simpson for the murders, and that I did do.
And what about Dylan Roof?
Dylan Roof was the man who did a mass murder in Charleston, and I did evaluate him, yes.
And in these instances, so those cases, and then you said there were hundreds more, is that fair to say?
Of criminal cases?
Criminal cases that you have been involved as a forensic psychiatrist?
Yes.
And in those cases, are you only an expert for one side, say the prosecution versus the defense?
No.
Have you testified as a defense expert before?
Yes.
Have you been accepted as an expert in forensic psychiatry on previous occasions?
Yes.
And where?
In most, if not all, states in the U.S., most, if not all, federal jurisdictions in the U.S., Canada, and one military court in Germany.
How many times have you been qualified as an expert in a criminal proceeding? Just a ballpark.
The same as the number I've testified in, so hundreds.
Okay.
Well, more than 100 for sure, less than 200 since 1980. Let me correct that. Since 1990, when I started putting them all on my CV.
You said in the course of your career you've worked on behalf of both the prosecution, so a federal agency or a state agency, right?
Yes.
You've also worked as an expert or consultant for the defense, right?
Yes.
Do you have any idea what the split between the two would be? Are you, more favorable to the defense versus prosecution? Do you have any idea what the numbers are?
I do know where it is, yes. During those years at Bridgewater in the 1970s, all of the cases were court ordered. So it was the judge who sent the case. It wasn't for one side or the other. Then when I was at the University of Virginia, the cases were mostly referred by the defense because of the history of the clinic that I inherited. And we were doing about 75 a year, and I had to work to get some prosecution referrals and eventually balance that somewhat. Then when I went into private practice, I got so many referrals from prosecutors and law enforcement that it was getting unbalanced again in favor of the prosecution. So I had to work to try to get defense cases. And in the recent years, it's been very balanced 50-50.
Is that balance important to you?
Yes, it is.
Why?
Because I think the whole purpose of my field should be to seek the truth as objectively as we can. And the objective search for truth is threatened when there are biasing forces at work. And there are always biasing forces trying to influence how one views the world, whether it's coming from clients or from the press or from one's friends or colleagues. It's a struggle to try to keep as objective and unbiased as humanly possible. And I think it's helpful to be working for both sides, to be able to see it through the lenses of both prosecutors and defense counsel.
When is the last time you were involved in a defense case?
I'm involved in them now.
When is the last time you were anticipated to testify in a defense case?
December
December of what year?
2021.
And when was the last time you wrote a report on behalf of a defendant or a defense case?
That would have been January 2022.
And what kind of case was that?
That was a mass murder.
All of those matters that you were qualified as an expert to testify in a court proceeding, was that with the title of forensic psychiatry, so an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry?
I believe it always would have included that. There might be a couple cases where I was also identified as an expert on something more specific, such as sex crimes or violent crimes or assassination, but always forensic psychiatry as the broad heading, unless there was a case or two where it was just as a criminologist.
Okay. As an expert, have you offered your opinion as to the legal sanity of defendants in criminal cases before?
Yes, the legal sanity of defendants is one of the things I'm most commonly asked to do.
As an expert in a case where you were hired by, say, the prosecution to do an evaluation, have you ever found someone to be legally insane?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I did a search of a series of cases, consecutive cases, to see where my opinions were falling. And out of 9 consecutive cases in which I found someone insane, I was working for the prosecution in 7 of them.
So 7 out of 9 of the last ones you looked up.
Yes,
You were hired by prosecution
yes,
to do an evaluation of the defendant, and your determination was that you were legally insane.
correct.
And you provide that information, obviously, to the prosecution, right?
Yes, and in 6 of them, they accepted that, and 1 they didn't, and cross-examined me relentlessly.
Judge, at this time, we would offer Dr. Park Dietz as an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry.
Any board here?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
Sure.
Welcome back to Monmouth County, Dr. Dietz.
Thank you.
It is now my chance to cross-examine you. This is in my wheelhouse, so Judge, can I move it?
Sure.
Thanks. And if you don't mind, can we remove the State versus Scott Kologi from the PowerPoint so we don't have to look at that anymore? Thanks. All right, Dr. Dietz, let's start this thing off with something you said on direct examination, which was limiting my practice now to mass murder and serial killers. That's what you said, right?
Yes, I'm trying to limit my criminal practice to mass murder, serial murder, and assassination.
Understood. And you also said that you had some criminal defense cases that you were working on behalf of the defense, right?
Yes,
And in December, you were slated to potentially testify in a case December 2021. You mentioned that, right?
yes.
That was not a murder case, was it?
No, and I didn't say it was.
I know you didn't, but I'm asking you now.
It was not a murder
What
case.
was that case?
sex trafficking.
It was sex trafficking. Who did you represent? Who were you working on behalf of, should I say?
The attorneys who were working on behalf of and represented Ghislaine Maxwell.
Ghislaine Maxwell, that's right. The attorneys who were working for Ghislaine Maxwell hired you for an opinion for her case for trafficking underage women, or conspiring to traffic underage women to have sex. Is that right?
They hired me in that case to profile Jeffrey Epstein.
We're going to get into that a little later on. I just want to make it clear that that's not a mass murder case, right?
Of course not.
That is not a serial killer case, is it?
No.
And that's the last case you were slated to testify on December of 2021, but you didn't testify in that case, right?
Correct.
Okay. Just making sure I got that right. So let's talk about treating psychiatry. Treating psychiatry. You haven't done it since late 1980s, right?
That's right.
Then you moved to California and focused your practice on forensic psychiatry.
Yes.
Way back in 1969, let's call it, you knew you wanted to focus your practice on crime, right? You had that feeling?
I'm not sure I knew it in '69, but somewhere in the '70s I certainly knew it.
It was around that time you said, man, I like this crime stuff. I'm going to get into it.
I think it was, let's see, yeah, 68 or 69. You're right.
68 or 69. Probably I got it, right?
Yeah.
And that was when you were at the school bookstore. I guess it's got to be Cornell at that point, right?
It was, yeah.
Or we had Johns Hopkins at that point.
Cornell campus store.
We're at the Cornell campus bookstore, and you're going through a book on forensic pathology.
Correct. It's called forensic medicine, but it was mostly pathology.
And in that book on forensic medicine, but mostly on pathology, you see a man who's dead, hanging, right?
Yes.
And he's naked,
Yes.
and beneath him is scattered pornography.
Correct.
And that spoke to you, right?
It was so weird. I wanted to understand how could that happen.
Right. That's when you had this epiphany at that point. You said, man, I got to get into this stuff, right?
Now, the epiphany was that there was a way for me to fulfill my family mandate to go to medical school, and at the same time to study crime.
I can appreciate that because I had a family mandate to go to law school, so I can appreciate that. So you didn't necessarily want to practice medicine. You had a different interest, and you figured you might be able to accomplish both, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let me see if I got this right. This was around, later on you talked about this in an article, and that was when you said that the impact was huge when you had this moment in the bookstore, right?
I don't remember what I said for that, but that's true.
Yes, and you got interested, and this is a quote that's attributed to you. You can tell me if it's wrong or not, okay? I got interested in electrocution, homicide cases, all kinds of really bizarre stuff. Infanticide, when a mom kills her baby within its first year, that kind of thing. I was majoring in medicine, but my secret agenda was to relate everything to crime, right?
That doesn't sound like a true quotation because there is no such thing as a major in medicine.
Why don't we go through it together? I think you might have been sarcastic, but I'll go through it with you anyway. Okay? This is from, can I approach your Honor?
You can, do you want to have that marked?
Yeah, let's have that marked. I gotta get a clean copy for Dr. Dietz. Because I write on everything, it's all a mess over here. Why don't we mark this as D...
12?
I think we're at 13, right?
D13 for identification. Thank you so much. Doctor, I'm going to approach to you Yeah, I got it, sure, absolutely. Let me know when you're done. Doctor, what I'm approaching with for you is an article from the Los Angeles Times. I'm gonna slip around, okay?
Okay.
All right. Let's go together to page. I did both sides, okay? So we're gonna flip to the third flip. Does that make sense?
Okay.
And on the top, it says, with the doctor, father, and grandfather, which you had previously said, you had a family tradition to go into medical school, right?
That's true, but I haven't found where you're,
I'm gonna get there. We're gonna get there together. Do you see in 1969?
yes.
Okay, let's go 2 paragraphs lower. That's the quote I read to you. And it's attributed to you. You can say whether it's not true or not, but want to go over it together?
Yeah, I may have said it. You might be right. It was a sarcastic way of phrasing it. That could be accurate.
They got it right at times. Yeah.
I assume so.
Thank you, sir. Let's move back to treating psychiatry. You talked about the difference between treating and forensic, and what was, you used a phrase, let's go through it. It was, oh, come on, help me out, doctor, duality, what was it?
Dual agency.
Dual agency. That really, that's a concern more when you're doing a dual agency for the same patient, wouldn't it be, right? As opposed to doing forensic psychiatry and practicing clinical psychiatry where your subjects have no relationship whatsoever with one another, right?
There's no dual agency to treat one patient and forensically evaluate a different one. It does become an issue of dual agency if one is treating someone and then switches to a forensic evaluation of the same person.
I recognize that, but I'm asking you whether in that situation where you can have them separate, there's no dual, what is it?
Dual agency, that's right.
Okay. And you'll agree with me that you can be a treating psychiatrist and also a forensic psychiatrist, right?
Certainly.
Okay, so maybe you can have 20% of your practice where you're seeing people in the office and helping them with their problems as a treating psychiatrist, and then you do, the other 80% can be forensic evaluations like you do, right?
Yes, one could do that or any permutation of time.
50-50, 75-25,
Sure.
whatever you want.
That's right.
You made a decision in 1990, you're not going to do that, right?
Right, I decided that I'm going to spend my time doing forensic evaluations and prevention. I don't have room for any more
You didn't have any more room for what?
for treating patients.
Why not? What do you mean, any more what, time?
Pardon me?
You didn't have any more time?
No, I'm very busy. I work 7 days a week and have my entire career, and I don't know how I'd squeeze patient care in, nor do I know how with my travel schedule over most of my career I could have done it.
Well, you could have not done other things, right?
Yes, one sets priorities.
One as priorities, could have not done all those TV shows, right? 169 episodes of Law and Order, we could have not done those.
Yeah, that wouldn't have made much difference. That was sort of a hobby in the evenings. It was actually 250 episodes, I think.
250 episodes, it's 10 pages of your CV is filmography, 10 pages. That's a lot of time, no?
I don't think so.
Well, I mean, I can go through it all with you if you want, Doctor. If you tell me it's not a lot of time, we can go through all.
It's a lot of episodes, but
Yeah.
how much
No,
time?
I'm not talking about Law and
Yeah.
Order alone. I'm talking about the movies, I'm talking about the TV docuseries, I'm talking about the HBO specials. That's a lot of time, no?
It's some. I probably spend at most 5 to 10 days a year on that. At other times, it might only be 1 or 2 days a year.
And at times maybe more, right?
I don't know that it's ever been more than that.
Could have treated patients during that time though, right?
If there were patients who'd be willing to be scheduled at those hours, yeah.
All right. So, you'll agree with me that a treating psychiatrist has a relationship with their patient that is different than a forensic psychiatrist's relationship with the person they're evaluating. Is that correct?
Yes,
So the treating psychiatrist may see their patient over several days, months, years, right?
certainly.
Sure. They can see the evolution of a disease or a thing that they're dealing with over time, right?
If they're seeing someone long-term, yes.
Sure. So if maybe somebody has an anxiety issue, for example, and they are treating for, I'll call it, a year and a half with a psychiatrist. That psychiatrist will be able to see that person through that period of time and make different observations about that experience, right?
Yes,
And also, if they're taking medication or not, but if they're taking medication, they can see how that person responds to the medication, right?
that's true.
And if a psychiatrist is treating a patient, they can see through their sessions, maybe we're doing psychotherapy, where that person has found that things are triggering them in their communities, where they're getting triggered by maybe an enemy or a family member or something. They may understand those things over time better than at one snapshot, right?
Certainly, the videotape is more complete than the snapshot, yes.
And we're not talking about your videotape, we're talking about the long version of an experience versus a
Yes.
short version of an experience.
That's right.
Right. I will note that you back up your videotape with audio just like our court does, and that's very good. So we've needed that several times in this trial.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, that treating psychiatrist has an experience that you wouldn't have as a forensic psychiatrist, right? And I'm talking about recently, over the last 30 years.
But I haven't done long-term treatment of patients for a very long time.
Okay, let's go to the Yates case, Dr. Dietz. I know you've done this many times, so I'm going to ask you to tell me if I'm wrong or not. In that case, you testified on cross-examination about one of the Law and Order shows that you thought had been created. Is that right? And had played.
I testified about an episode of Law and Order. That's correct.
And the episode of Law and Order that you testified about just happened to be the exact same fact scenario as the case that you were working on that day. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. And it was that a mother of 4 drowned her children in the bathtub, right?
Yes.
And you said, as a matter of fact, there was a show of a woman with postpartum depression who drowned her children in the bathtub and was found insane after it was aired shortly before the crime occurred. Now, I'm reading that correctly, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And that was relevant because this was an insanity trial, right?
Yes.
And the implication that the prosecutor took was that this was an idea she came up with from this television program, right?
Well, he acted as if he took that implication. Seemingly, he forgot that he's the one that told me that.
I am aware he told you that. He told you about this show that didn't exist, right?
Correct.
You guys had a conversation about it, and then it triggered this thing in you to go and testify about it in that case, right?
Many months or a year after he told me this during a car ride, that sentence came back to me.
Right. You took the oath just like you did here. You put your hand on the Bible. You swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and you gave false testimony. Is that right?
I forgot where I read it, where I heard it.
I understand. And the jury came back with a guilty verdict and sentenced Mrs. Yates to death. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the defense in that case found out that there was never that TV show airing shortly before. In fact, there was no TV show that you described at all, right?
Not of Law and Order. It's speculated that it was a different television series that the member of the community wrote in about describing that. But we've never identified what she might have been talking about.
Right, but you testified to it, right?
Yes, I forgot the source of my memory.
I know you did. And then, after this conviction and sentencing to death, the defense found out that it was not true, you conceded it, right?
Pardon me?
You conceded it. After the defense discovered it, you conceded it that it was false testimony.
I didn't know that the defense had discovered it, but when I discovered that there was no such episode, I contacted the prosecutors, said, this thing I said about that episode isn't true, and I'm willing to come back at my own expense and correct the record. And they said, don't
Go back
bother.
at that point. You couldn't go back.
Well, I don't know, but they said, don't bother.
And they said, don't bother because you've been sentenced to death.
No, this was still during the trial.
Well, they said that you couldn't come back. And you stipulated, you did concede, but they said you couldn't come back. Right?
They
That's the
told-
question. The question is, could you come back or not? That's the question.
Could I?
I'm sorry, objection. There was an insertion of facts without allowing a question. So the insertion of something that Mr. Lomurro said is not being allowed to be answered by the witness, and then he's asking for a yes or no to the second part of his statement.
Yeah, I think you had a compound question, but I'll allow you to ask the question, but you got to just ask one at a time. I think there was two in one.
I
That's,
appreciate that, thank you.
so it is a compound question. I'll sustain the objection to that.
I am going to withdraw that unlawful question. Let's move on to the appeal. So the case ultimately was brought before a three-judge panel, right?
Yes.
And the three-judge panel unanimously decided that that conviction had to be thrown out, right?
Yes.
All right. And the three-judge panel stated in their decision, if you need a copy, let me know. Do you want a copy or not?
Depends on what you ask.
I'm just going to tell you what they decided, their conclusion. In their conclusion, they said, we conclude that there is a reasonable likelihood that Dr. Dietz's false testimony could have affected the judgment of the jury. We further conclude that Dr. Dietz's false testimony affected the substantial rights of the appellant. Am I reading that correctly?
You're reading it correctly.
Thank you. When the case was reversed by that appellate division, it was sent back down for a new trial, brand new trial, right?
Yes.
You testified in the new trial, and what happened? She was found.
Several things happened.
Well, let me.
One was that the jurors
Let me tell you the question.
pretended they hadn't been influenced by pretrial publicity, and then when they acquitted her, gave interviews on the courthouse steps saying, we knew what we were going to find before this started.
Well, let's just slow down 1 second. You said they acquitted her, right? Right?
Yes,
She was found not guilty by reason of sentence, is that right?
correct,
After she had been sentenced to death in the previous case, right?
correct.
Dr. Dietz, just bear with me for a moment, if you don't mind.
Take all the time you like.
May I have a moment, Judge?
You sure can.
Thank you. You previously testified that autism is not your strong suit, right?
I don't know.
Well, let's take a look at it.
Going to the expertise of the witness with regard to forensic psychiatry.
I'll hear you type our. So Lomurro, after we're done, you'll have to mark them. Somehow I'll have to mark that.
And I'll reduce this to a disc as well.
Okay.
Next, Judge.
Sure. Was I wrong about 12?
We need to make this 12. We essentially missed 12, so that should be the next thing.
I
Mark.
had some written for yesterday, but maybe I missed it.
I might have missed it too, so I'll go over it when we have a chance.
All right, let's just make this 14. So for the record purposes, these are going to be marked the 14.1 through 14.5. You said there's a total of 5, correct?
There's... Five, Your Honor.
Okay, so D 14.1 will be the first one. Go ahead.
Thanks, Judge. There we go. Okay, Dr. Dietz, if you don't mind, I'm going to go through a couple videos with you. And these are videos that you've done as part of your other career as a TV show guy. Okay?
It's not my career, it's more like a hobby.
All right, let's watch together. And I'm going to try my best to make sure the sound doesn't go crazy.
I have repeatedly told CNN, and we've had 20 years of mass murders, throughout which I have repeatedly told CNN and our other media, if you don't want to propagate more mass murders, don't start the story with sirens blaring. Don't have photographs of the killer. Don't make this 24/7 coverage.
Who is that guy?
That's a young me.
That's a young you. And for 20 years before that video, you said you've been telling the media, you gotta stop this stuff, right?
I've been trying, yes.
Makes a hitman tick. For the first time, this brutal killer speaks to the renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Mark Dietz, on camera. He's killed over 200 people, and he's still ticking. You think you've seen him before, but never quite like this.
You almost made me mad.
The Iceman and the psychiatrist.
Don't start with body count, right?
Yes.
Dr. Dietz has delved into the soul of some of the darkest, most horrible crimes that have ever been committed. I spend a lot of my time dealing with sex and violence.
Is that you too?
Yes.
I'm Dr. Park Dietz, and I'm about to meet a man that I've never met before. He's already serving time for one homicide, but yesterday he reached a plea agreement in which he admitted to killing 6 other women.
Is that you too? Is that you?
It was me and another person and pictures of victims.
Pictures of victims, don't talk about the body count, right?
That's right. And those 24 hours after the crime occurs, that's a very bad thing to do.
24 hours, well, it's a bad
The cases in the US is in Newport Beach in California now. Doctor, very good to talk to you. Well, you know the figures, I'm sure. More than 270 mass shootings in the US This year alone, I think on average more than 169 incidents of gun violence each day. This mass shooting, though, I think is unusual, isn't it?
It's unprecedented in the body count. This is the worst mass murder in modern U.S. history.
Don't talk about the body count within the 24 hours, right?
That's right. That should not be the lead.
Judge, I have no objection to Dr. Dietz being qualified as an expert in forensic psychiatry. Thank you, Doctor.
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard me give you this charge before. I'll give it to you one more time because we're at a new day and I just want to confirm. As a general rule, witnesses can testify only as to facts known by them. This rule ordinarily does not permit the opinion of a witness to be received as evidence. However, an exception to this rule exists in the case of an expert witness who may give his opinion as to any matter in which he is versed, which is material to this case. In legal terminology, an expert witness is a witness who has some specialized knowledge, skill, experience, or training that is not possessed by an ordinary juror, and who thus may be able to provide assistance to the jury in understanding the evidence presented and determining the facts of the case. It is always within the special function of the jury to determine whether the facts on which the answer or testimony of an expert is based actually exist. The value or weight of the opinion of an expert is dependent upon and is no stronger than the facts on which it is based. In other words, the probative value of the opinion will depend upon whether from all of the evidence in the case you find those facts are true. You may in fact determine from the evidence in the case that the facts that form the basis of the opinion are true, not true, or are only partly true. And in light of those findings, you should decide what effect such determination has upon the weight to be given to the opinion of the expert. Your acceptance or rejection of the expert opinion will depend, therefore, to some extent, on your findings as to the truth of the facts relied upon. In this particular case, this court is finding that Dr. Park Dietz is an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry. Prosecutor, you can continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, I just want to ask you a few things about the questions that you just had. So clear some stuff up before we move on, okay? First of all, with the Andrea Yates trial, you got bits and pieces of that out there. Can you tell the jurors what exactly happened, in what order it happened in that trial? With regard to you, obviously not the entirety of the case.
With regard to this mistake, so sometime well before the trial, when I was in Houston, I think it was, to evaluate Mrs. Yates, I was driving to lunch with one of the prosecutors who told me of two wacky theories he had. One was that Rusty Yates, Andrea Yates' husband, had been having an affair and that the children were killed in retaliation for the affair. I told him, no, that's not why the children were killed. I don't know if he had an affair or not, but she killed her children because she's mentally ill. So, well, the second thing is a civilian wrote that there was an episode of Law and Order in which a woman drowned her children and then was found insane, and it aired just before this case. And I said, and he said, would you check it out? I said, no, that's not why she killed her children. She's not imitating a TV show. She killed her children because she's mentally ill. And that was the end of that. I never checked. Fast forward months later, I'd submitted a lengthy report which certainly doesn't mention any such episode of Law and Order. It talks about her mental illness and why she drowned her children and how we can know whether she knew it was wrong or didn't know it was wrong. And Then I testified about why she did or didn't know it was wrong and whether she knew the nature and quality of her act. And on cross, this issue came up asking me the question, is law and order about women's mental health? And I remembered a sentence and spoke it. It's the sentence that was described and that's wrong. I forgot where I had that information from. It's called it's a source attribution error that everybody makes. It's a normal mistake. You forget, did you read it in the Wall Street Journal or did your neighbor tell you? You don't know. And I didn't know where that sentence came from. That's my mistake. But then many other things happened along the way as I tried to correct the error. I still didn't know where I'd gotten that from, and I struggled to try to figure it out. I looked up all sorts of episodes, thought maybe I'm confusing this piece with that piece and conflating different episodes. Couldn't quite put it together, thought maybe I was conflating it with other cases I'd worked on where mothers killed their children. Wrote a letter explaining as best I could the error, and I spoke to the prosecutors and said, look, there's no such episode. It's wrong. I want to fly back and correct my error. I'll do it at my expense. They said, no need, just write a letter and we'll put it in the record as a stipulation. I said, all right, so this letter was my effort to try to set it straight, but I still didn't remember where I learned this. They showed that letter to the defense, but they did not put it in the record. And Mrs. Yates was convicted somewhere in that time frame. And there was no way I could do anything further to correct it.
So while you have finished testifying in that case, you fly back to California.
Yes.
And you on your own realize that you have made an error.
No, I didn't. I got a phone call from one of the writers at Law and Order saying, what episode were you talking about in the Yates case? I said, well, I think it might be the episode named Angel. That's one I recall where there was a mother killing her kid. He said, no, we looked at that. It's not a drowning. It was something else. I said, well, I don't know. Do you have people looking? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I'll look too. I'll look through the scripts I've got. I don't remember what it came from. And so we spent lots of time trying to find it.
And this is while the case was still pending trial. The trial was still going on, right?
As far as I know, yes.
And when you realize it, you bring it to the attention of the prosecution?
Yes.
And you write a letter
Yes.
explaining exactly what happened?
Well, trying to.
And you are told that letter is going to be entered into the record, right?
Right.
But it wasn't.
Right.
Okay, so that was a mistake that you made, right?
Yes.
And who attempted to fix the mistake immediately?
Well, I did for one. I think others might have too. I don't know.
You were also asked a bunch of questions about your experience as a clinical psychiatrist versus your experience as a forensic psychiatrist. You asked why you don't treat patients anymore. Why is it that you don't treat patients anymore, doctor?
I think there are a couple reasons. One reason is that for many years I was traveling so much that there was no way that it would be fair to patients to keep rescheduling them. When you're in court, things don't go according to plan. And I thought I'd be testifying 2 days ago. I didn't. So if you're testifying every week or two, you can't possibly keep a very active patient load. Second, I was on call for these prevention cases for many years, around the clock, and had contracts where I had to be available 24/7 to be able to respond to threat emergencies. That didn't seem to be fair to patients either. And I felt I was getting plenty of exposure to people in crisis by handling threats 24/7 and didn't need patients calling with similar things. Seemed to me I was getting a pretty good view of what was going on in the world through that and through the forensic work.
You had testified that you do preventative work for your group, right?
Yes.
And that you also do your forensic psychiatry work to attempt to address and identify problems, right?
Well, the forensic work is always after the fact. Something's gone wrong, and usually someone's hurt or there's been a crime, often crimes where someone's hurt. The bad thing's already occurred. So that's, for the lawyers, it's about justice or about who gets the money. For me, it's about trying to understand what went wrong and about trying to analyze whatever the law requires we analyze. But it doesn't actually fix problems or prevent them. Preventive work is much more rewarding in the sense that sometimes we know we've saved people's lives.
The clips that you were showing, the one where you were saying that you shouldn't talk about body counts and that kind of stuff. You saw those clips, right?
Yes.
And then you were showing other clips from different interviews and forensic psychiatry-related shows you've done, right?
They aren't even forensic psychiatry related. Each of those clips is from something, from a variety of things. One was a purely entertainment production by HBO called The Iceman and the Psychiatrist, in which he lied to me the whole way through the show. I told HBO when he was lying and when he wasn't. They went ahead and aired his lies anyway as if it were real. I had no involvement in his case. I was hired by HBO to do an interview. So it was entertainment. The other one that showed an older man that I was about to interview, that one I was a co-producer on it, and the DA's office had asked me if I'd evaluate this guy, and I asked if I could film it, and they said, yeah, instead of paying you, we'll let you bring in a film crew to do it. I said, all right. What they were really looking for was to find new bodies in order to be able to help get closure for victim families, because there were some of his murder victims whose bodies had never been recovered. So I did an on-camera interview, and we also went out in the field as he tried to find the bodies he'd buried, but didn't succeed then. So that was not pure entertainment. There was a good goal as well. And then some of the others were newscasts where the news agency is asking me to comment on something that they had put into the news.
And in those cases, do you find those to be related, your forensic work where you're doing an evaluation of someone who's been charged with something and now you're dealing with them in the criminal setting versus the prevention aspect that you were talking about on CNN?
I don't understand what you're asking, but there's a big difference between my forensic work and my preventive work.
Okay, so side by side, they don't really go together, or they do?
Well, one would hope that they would try to improve the world either way.
As a forensic psychiatrist, do you make it a point to understand the legal concepts and the frameworks for sanity versus insanity in whatever jurisdiction you're in?
Yes.
Why is that important?
Well, because always when I'm being asked in a forensic context is to address some specific legal issue, and the law matters. If I don't address the right legal issue, then I'm wasting everyone's time.
Could you explain the criteria for sanity versus legal insanity in New Jersey, the way that you would apply it? So the court, to be clear, the court is going to give the jurors an instruction on what the law is and is not. But what framework did you follow in doing your evaluation in New Jersey?
The framework I followed was my understanding of New Jersey law, that the critical issues were whether mental disease or defect on the part of the defendant led to either of two problems. The first is whether the mental issue caused the defendant to lack the ability to appreciate the nature and quality of his actions. Second, whether the defendant's mental state caused the defendant to lack the ability to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. These are two very distinct, separate issues.
When you say they're very distinct and separate, what do you mean?
A person may have both of those abilities intact. That is, one defendant may know the nature and quality of actions and know that what he's doing is wrong. Another defendant may not know nature and quality and may not know what's wrong. And then there are defendants who know nature and quality but don't know what's wrong, or who know it's wrong but don't know nature and quality. So there are four possibilities when looking at these two issues, and each is important.
Is there a difference between mentally ill and schizophrenia?
Yes.
What is that difference?
So mental illness is a broad term for some but not all of the mental disorders contained in the DSM-5. It is a somewhat vague clinical term of what's wrong with the human mind. Insanity is now a completely legal concept. It is not a medical concept at all. And confusion arises because laymen will sometimes talk about something being insane. And they don't necessarily mean one or the other, but the word insanity is the source of confusion. Mental illness, mental disease, mental disorder, these are clinical concepts. Insanity, strictly speaking, is a legal concept only.
Can you be mentally ill and be sane?
A person can be mentally ill and sane, and a person can also be mentally ill and insane. Both are possible.
Do you have experience with persons who have been, or people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia?
Do I have experience with people diagnosed with schizophrenia?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
How much experience are we talking?
Hundreds, thousands. With respect to clinical care, of course, I've treated schizophrenic patients in the hospital, many in the emergency room. With respect to evaluations, I've evaluated a great many people, especially those charged with crimes who've had schizophrenia. And with respect to the preventive work, several times a year, our client is struggling with a schizophrenic employee who suddenly behaving bizarrely in the workplace, and they need to know what to do, and we walk them through it and how to help with it. So throughout my career, I've dealt with schizophrenia and its effects on other people.
Does that mean you also would then have experience with people who have emotional disturbances or mental disabilities?
Yes. Yeah, that's true for just about any mental disorder that if I haven't seen it clinically, I've seen it in the preventive work or forensically.
What does it mean to be emotionally disturbed?
There's no technical meaning to the term emotionally disturbed. I would use it to refer to an even broader range of conditions that may not amount to mental illness, but would include certainly anyone who has an anxiety disorder, anyone who has a mood disorder, and lots of developmental disorders as well. They don't all rise to the level of mental disease or mental illness. Some less severe things would be included in emotional disturbance.
You had just mentioned earlier, you said the DSM-5. What is that?
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5th edition, published in 2013 by the American Psychological Association in Arlington, Virginia.
I'm not going to ask you to go through this, and mine's dog-eared, but if I can just approach, Judge. Thank you.
I may have just misspoken. It's American Psychiatric Association, if I didn't say that.
Psychiatric Association. Okay, I'm handing you a book. What is that?
That's the DSM-5.
Okay. Is that the book you were just referring to?
Yes.
Generally speaking, do you use that book often within your work?
Not every single day, but every week, yes.
How so?
Well, anytime I'm writing a report that is about some psychiatric matter, I'm going to verify that the person meets the criteria in DSM-5. I'll double check that a diagnosis is accurate. From time to time, I want to explain to a colleague why I agree or disagree with the diagnosis, and I'll point them to the right page in DSM-5. If I'm advising a lawyer about a case, I may guide them to the right section of DSM-5. It's very important as a set of standards and rules for diagnosis. It's not the entire knowledge, obviously, of psychiatry. It doesn't say much about treatment. But for diagnosis, which is central to both treatment and forensic work, it's the best we have.
So if someone wanted to find, if someone wanted to find the accepted criteria or symptoms of a certain mental illness, could they look in that book and try to figure it out?
Yes.
Is the DSM-5 made for lawyers in the court system?
No, it's made
What's it
for
made for?
clinicians.
Okay. And do you often find that you have to explain things within the DSM-5 to lawyers in a different way?
Yes.
How so?
Well, there's a quality known as clinical judgment that people who've never been clinicians may lack, that they don't know how much weight to put on something. They may have difficulty determining, does someone actually have this or not, when they've read a description of a symptom. It's like looking up your symptoms on the internet. You can rapidly conclude you have some fatal rare illness because you have symptoms that are common to many things, including fatal rare illness you just happened to read about. It requires some clinical judgment to differentiate between the possibilities and put things in the correct category. And that comes with experience and with training.
Using the DSM-5, you said it's something that you do at least every week.
Yes.
Do you follow any specific standards, just in speaking about diagnosis, do you follow any specific standards, or do you have any common practice with regard to methods you take in a forensic psychiatric setting or a forensic psychiatric evaluation?
Methods for diagnosis?
Yes.
Actually, yes, I do. We haven't talked about this, so you don't know where I'm going, but one of the things that I have always trained my trainees to do is, before they make a diagnosis of something that requires an example of the behavior at issue, I want them to be able to give me 3 examples. So, for example, when I hand documents to a graduate student to summarize something for me, if they're summarizing clinical records, I don't want them to just say this person has hallucinations or this person has delusions. If they can't give me 3 examples of exactly what it was, I don't believe it's true. So that's the rule of 3. And nurses' notes, psychologists' notes, mental health counselor notes will often have examples in quotation marks of things that qualify as a particular symptom. But if they just say they have the symptom, I don't trust it. I want to hear what it was. What did the voice say? What did the person say they saw? I don't just want a conclusion about it. So that's one methodologic issue. I already mentioned the methodologic issue about videotaping the exam of the person whose behavior is at issue. That's an important one to me, and I've been a proponent of that for a very long time.
And if I came to you and I said, I need an evaluation done of a certain individual, I'm either a defense attorney or I'm a prosecutor, and I have, a certain suspicion about them. Can you help me? Can you do an evaluation? What is your first step? What do you do? What do you look at?
Well, it depends on what's the legal issue. If the issue is a screening because somebody's just been arrested and on behalf of the jail you want to know if they're suicidal, that's one set of issues. If the issue is the person's been arrested, you're the defense attorney, and you want to know whether this person was competent to make a confession, that's different from whether they're competent to stand trial. If you want to know whether they're sane or insane, that's going to be a bigger question because we need a lot of documents before we can even begin to try to answer it.
Okay, so if my question is, are they sane or insane? Take that example. Where do you start? You said there's a lot of documents that you have to review. What is your general practice in starting an evaluation?
If the lawyer already has sophistication and trial experience, they may know what they need to package up, and I'll receive a package of material. And then I'm free to ask for anything that's missing. If they aren't very experienced with it, I'll send them a 2-page list of all the things that I'm looking for. That's just our standard records request in that kind of case. And we have records requests for various kinds of issues that come before the court that we're often consulted on. And so the records that are always going to be needed in an insanity case are the educational records of the defendant, the medical records from childhood on, any military records, any occupational records from jobs that the person may have had, any correctional records and police records from past offenses that an individual may have, the entire file of the current criminal investigation. And that may grow over time as the case proceeds. Sometimes these evaluations go on for years with records continuously arriving in various quantities. Any videotapes and photos, any lab reports from the electronic devices that have been searched, any forensic lab reports, so that is certainly going to include toxicology and autopsies in a murder case. It's going to include ballistics, and in some cases is going to involve other forensic sciences. Ongoing correctional records, because those change and are continuing and are generated day by day. The audio tapes from recorded calls in correctional facilities. Occasionally there are videotapes from visits in the correctional facility. I may suggest that the correspondence from the inmate be copied and scrutinized and that those be sent. And so, depending on the specific facts of the case, some of these things may not exist. But if they exist, the forensic evaluator ought to look at as much of it as humanly possible before the first evaluation. And if they keep being generated, may need another evaluation to go back and update what was done previously.
So you're not just looking at the background history of a defendant, you're looking at paper documents that could grow in real time.
Yes.
So before the incident that they're charged with, the actual incident itself, and then things that happen afterward?
Yes, and often that's the way the reports are organized, to be able to have the pre-offense history of the person, the offense history in great detail, and the post-offense events. And this is in keeping with what's necessary to approach every person, whether as a patient or evaluee, from the 4 different perspectives of psychiatry.
What are those?
And this, I should attribute the source. It's from a book by Paul McHugh and Philip Slavny called The Perspectives of Psychiatry. They were mentors of mine at Johns Hopkins, and they published this book. And the 4 perspectives that they outline, which I think is enormously useful. First is the life story. We need to understand a person's life story to put in perspective what things mean to them. The meaning comes out of the life story. Second, the concept of disease. Is there a disease process going on here? And by disease, I mean something rather specific, where there is a pathological process to explain the observations of abnormal behavior. Not every strange thing people do is based on disease. People do very strange things for other reasons. But if there's a disease, it's important to get to it because that has a biological basis and that has implications for treatment and more. The third perspective has to do with what might be called habits, patterns of behavior that some people have and some don't, and people may have in varying degrees, but it's habitual behavior. So that would include things like obsessions and compulsions, sexual deviations, impulse control problems like gambling or fire setting. These patterns are important, even though they're not diseases. We still need to recognize and pay attention to the pattern. The same be true of substance abuse. It's a pattern. And then the fourth perspective is that there are dimensions of behavior. Quite apart from illness, many aspects of human behavior is along a spectrum or dimensional, so that you can have a little of it or a lot of it. You can have too little of it or too much of it. And that would be true of characteristics like introversion versus extroversion. IQ is a dimensional concept of how smart someone is, but it's quite easy to think in terms of dimensions and to develop ways of measuring some dimensions. And we're used to measuring height and weight by dimension as a dimensional concept, but we don't often think that way about how polite versus rude is someone. You could measure that and rate people according to a scale. Same is true of some of the disease concepts. For example, anxiety can be rated on a scale, and many doctors do rate it on a scale. Same with depression. So dimensions matter too. And those are the four perspectives.
So when you're approaching this evaluation, you're focusing on life story, disease, habit, and dimensions. And that's just kind of a global approach to all of the different things that you might take in with regard to a reviewed case or a reviewed person.
Correct.
When you're taking all of that information in, do you ever consider any other opinions or diagnosis or treatment of that person with regard to the question you're answering?
Sure. I need to pay attention to every tidbit of information I can get. And if other people have made a diagnosis, I want to know about it, and I need to consider from my vantage point with all the data available to me Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? Did they almost get it right? Is there certain information they're lacking? So I'm judging every step of the way my predecessors as to whether they observed the right things, recognized the right pattern. Did they fail to look at places they should have looked?
Do you ever come to a conclusion before you start that evaluation process? So say I call and I say, I'm a defense attorney, I'm a prosecutor, I need you to look at this person, here's some information about the case, what do you think? Do you ever give a conclusion at that point?
No, of course not.
Why not?
Well, I mean, sometimes one can guess where it's heading from the facts given, but you can't rely on those facts. I teach my trainees never to believe what the lawyer tells you. Even the ones who are trying the hardest to tell the truth, they're advocates. They're going to have a point of view, so you can't rely on them. That's why I feel so ridiculous about this Andrea Yates thing. I believed something from the prosecutor, violated my own rule.
I don't know where to look. Well, in those instances, though, it's important for you, right, to keep a discerning eye regarding who's giving you the information or who's writing stuff down in records.
Oh, yeah. See, this is another difference between clinical and forensic work. I mentioned that in clinical work, one needs to expect the patient wants to get better, and so they generally tell the truth as they believe it to be. If somebody is psychotic, their idea of the truth may not be reality, but they're trying to tell you the truth as they believe it to be. In forensic work, we expect that we are not going to be dealing with people who want always to tell the truth. And so we are always looking for distortions of several kinds. One kind of distortion is trying to paint a picture that isn't true, so they're intentionally misrepresenting. Another kind of distortion is changes that happen over time as people are influenced by other people in their environment or other factors in their environment so that their story evolves. Another kind of influence is that various witnesses may have different points of view and saw different things at different times, but even the witnesses may be motivated to paint a picture a particular way to help or hurt the defendant. And so in forensic work, one has to be skeptical of everything. Everything the defendant says, everything the witness says, everything other evaluators say, and healthy skepticism toward one's own opinion, because one can start to go down the wrong path in one's analysis of a case. You need to pull back and say, wait a minute, that's wrong. Here's more evidence that shows my initial view isn't correct.
If I was someone to come to you for treatment, would you have that same discerning or skeptical or, I guess, questioning approach
A clinician,
to my face?
a clinician shouldn't.
Why?
Because it would harm the trusting relationship that needs to be developed with the patient. And this is one of the other reasons that I'm no longer suitable for doing treatment. I've been lied to by so many people for so many decades that I don't think I could avoid skepticism.
So the way, again, you've already said that you would approach those two things very differently, right?
Yes, they're quite different roles with a different starting point, a different goal, different values, different rules, different methods.
And back to the forensic evaluation, you were going through your methodology. Is there ever a point where you come to a conclusion about a case, where you've reviewed everything, you continue to review everything, you come to your conclusion, you make a finding, and the person who has asked you to do that evaluation and that finding doesn't like it, and they ask you to change it. You ever do that?
No, if it's, well, what happens when I give them the bad news varies depending on who that lawyer is and who they serve. But no, I would never change my opinions based on what a client wants.
Based on who's asking the question?
Correct.
Okay.
I do change my opinions if I get new information, new evidence, and it contradicts what I believe.
So you're not married to a conclusion if you get new evidence,
Correct.
but you are if someone's just asking you to change your mind.
Yeah, asking me to change it doesn't work.
Let's go to the sidebar for a second.
I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions for the day, okay? In April of 2018, were you contacted by the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office with regard to this case?
I was, by Barbara Suppa.
So, retired Assistant Prosecutor Barbara Supa, right?
Yes.
And based on the contact that you had with AP Supa, were you asked to evaluate the mental state of Scott Kologi at the time that these offenses were committed?
Yes.
Based on that conversation and those, I guess, the continuing conversations with the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office, did you in fact do that evaluation?
Yes, we were eventually retained. I don't know the date of the retention, and then began to receive materials and start the evaluation.
What was your understanding of what it was the prosecutor's office was asking you to do? I know you do a lot of different evaluations. What was the specific request in this case?
To evaluate the defendant's sanity or insanity at the time of the offenses.
Now, you've answered this generally before, but at the time that this request comes to you, or the time you're having these conversations, do you come to an immediate conclusion about the defendant's mental state at the time?
No, there's no way to do that because there'd be no data in hand except whatever the prosecution said.
In those continuing conversations, did you make any promises with regard to a potential outcome?
No, of course not.
So it wouldn't have been, well, he's likely this, and then I'll send you a report, right? You don't have those conversations.
No.
Were there any preconditions put upon you by anyone from the state, anyone from the prosecutor's office in doing this evaluation?
Only with respect to travel expenses.
And what were those preconditions out there?
$9 for breakfast, that kind of thing.
It's not a bad breakfast though for $9. You gotta admit that, right?
If there were McDonald's handy, that'd be
Hey, listen,
plenty.
there's nothing wrong with McDonald's every once in a while. All right, go ahead, prosecutor.
When you, well, I guess we should ask, now that we brought up the $9 breakfast, when you first started, right, when you first start doing this kind of work, clinical forensic psychiatry, did you have an hourly rate?
Yes.
What was your hourly rate back in 1970? Okay.
No, I wasn't doing it privately till 78.
Okay, 1978.
I'm not positive. It might have been $75 an hour. I know by 1982 it was $150 an hour.
So between those years, you increased how much you were able to charge per hour, right?
I think so. I'm just not sure of the earlier time.
What gave you the ability to increase your rate?
Experience standing in the field, things I had accomplished by then.
Now, I guess 10 years after that, were you able to charge more?
Yes.
Okay. And then 10 years after that, were you able to charge more per hour?
Yes.
Okay. Doctor, excuse me for being rude, but how much can you charge per hour now? Or how much do you charge per hour now to do a full forensic evaluation?
My government rate today is $800 per hour,
And what is the non-government rate?
$1,200 per hour.
There was a discount.
Yes, when it's public money.
So you weren't able to charge $800 an hour in 1978, right?
No.
What has allowed you to do that now?
Well, inflation's been a big help in that respect, but the other things have been, of course, more years of experience, more accomplishments, more standing in the field, and mostly it's a matter of only having so many hours in the day and so many days in a year available to sell or rent out that I've tried to do what I teach my associates and trainees to do, which is keep your rates low when you're trying to build a practice, and as you have more than you can handle, raise your rates to try to have the amount of work you want to do and not overcommit.
And in this case, there's an agreement, $800 per hour, right?
Yes,
And travel expenses and all of that, right?
yes.
And you've been working on this case since how long, 2018?
Since April of 2018.
April of 2018, right? And as a part of your work on this case, fast forward to the end of your evaluation, your formal evaluation, did you generate any sort of report?
Oh, yes.
Okay, what kind of report was that?
My report on the mental state of the defendant, that is what I was originally asked to evaluate, was submitted last October, I believe.
October of 2021?
Yeah, I don't actually know the date.
I have listed marked as State's Exhibit SR 71, if I can approach them.
You can.
Thank you. I've just handed you a binder. It's State's Rebuttal Exhibit 71. Do you recognize that?
I do.
What is it?
This is my report.
Okay. How many pages is that report?
The report itself is 264 pages long.
And do you have a signature on that report?
Yes.
Doctor, obviously, now that you're in the middle of testimony, as you know, you cannot talk to any of the attorneys at this point until we're done, okay?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Is there anything that we need to discuss before recess for today?
Judge, I would only say, is it okay if we talk to the doctor logistically to get him back?
Oh, of course.
to go?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to make
Yeah, that's
sure
different.
He knew he wasn't violating.
If not, he's going to be
Right.
walking around the streets. Don't do that. We got you covered in that regard. All right. Any other issues that we need to discuss? Anything that's come up so far?
I don't think so,
I don't
Judge.
think so, Judge.
Okay. All right.
See you
Thank you.
tomorrow.
All right. Everybody have a nice night. Be safe. Doctor, we'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.